I'm Alexander, 36 male. I live in a city known for its historic architecture, a place where I built my own life brick by brick both professionally and personally. As an architect, I appreciate structure, integrity, and the foundations things are built on. For my entire life, I believed my family was the strongest foundation I had, a structure that could weather any storm. But I was wrong. The person I trusted most was secretly orchestrating its demolition, leaving me standing alone in the rubble. This is the story of how I discovered that my own mother was the architect of my isolation, and how I used her own tools to expose the truth and reclaim my life. Before this story unfolds, I'd love to connect with you. Please let me know in the comments where you're watching from and what time it is in your corner of the world. It's amazing to see how far these stories can travel. If you had asked me a year ago to describe my family, I would have used words like close-knit, traditional, and supportive. We were the kind of family you see in holiday movies. My mother, Beatrice, was the undisputed matriarch. A retired art gallery curator, she carried herself with an air of sophisticated authority. Everything in her life was curated, from the art on her walls to the relationships she maintained. Her approval was the sun around which our family's solar system orbited. My father passed away about 10 years ago, which only intensified her role as the family's center of gravity. Her two sisters, my Aunt Helen and Aunt Margaret, along with their children, my cousins, completed our core unit. Aunt Helen, the elder and a retired bank teller, was gentle and easily led, often echoing my mother's opinions as if they were her own. Aunt Margaret, a high school history teacher, was quieter, more observant, and the one I felt I could have a real conversation with. Still, she rarely, if ever, went against Beatrice. No one did. My mother prided herself on the image of our perfect family. We had Sunday dinners, celebrated every minor holiday with enthusiasm, and our annual Christmas gathering was a legendary week-long affair at her meticulously decorated home. She loved to tell her friends, my Alexander, he's a brilliant architect, you know. He designs buildings, but his greatest creation will always be the life he builds for his family. The subtext was always clear, a life that met her standards. When I married Isabella, my mother was outwardly thrilled. Isabella was a freelance graphic designer, vibrant, creative, and a little bit of a free spirit. At first, Beatrice seemed to embrace her. She called Isabella the daughter she never had and paraded her around at social functions. I saw it as my mother finally accepting someone who was different from her usual, more conservative circle. I was naive. I mistook her expert curation for genuine affection. She wasn't welcoming Isabella into the family. She was placing a new, shiny object in her display case. The performance was flawless for years. Isabella tried hard, attending every family event, remembering every birthday, and learning my mother's countless unspoken rules. She'd spend hours picking out the perfect hostess gift, only for my mother to give a polite, tight-lipped smile and set it aside, never to be seen again. I noticed these small slights, but I dismissed them. That's just Mom, I'd say. She's particular. I was a fool. I was so conditioned to see my mother as the infallible core of our family that I couldn't recognize the subtle poison she was dripping into the foundations of my marriage. She would make comments disguised as compliments. Isabella, you're so brave to wear such a bold color, I could never pull it off. Or, it's wonderful that your freelance work gives you so much free time, you must enjoy the flexibility. Each comment was a tiny, expertly placed crack in the veneer. Isabella would come home from these gatherings feeling drained and insecure, and I would try to soothe her, never fully understanding the psychological weight of my mother's passive aggression. Isabella saw it long before I did. Your mother doesn't like me, Alex, she'd say late at night. She tolerates me. I would argue, defend my mother, and tell Isabella she was being too sensitive. I was protecting the image I had of my family, the one my mother had so carefully constructed for me. We began to argue more not about us, but about my mother. The strain grew, a silent wedge driven between us by a woman who smiled at us both over Sunday dinner. The truth is, my mother couldn't stand that she couldn't control Isabella. Isabella had her own career, her own opinions, and a spirit that couldn't be curated. She didn't fit neatly into the display case. Beatrice saw Isabella not as my partner, but as her rival for my attention and loyalty. And in my mother's world, there could only be one queen. My unbreakable family bond was, in reality, a gilded cage, and I was only just beginning. NG to see the bars. The foundation I had built my life upon wasn't solid stone. It was a hollow facade, and the architect of that facade was preparing to bring the whole thing down. The divorce was not a sudden explosion, but a slow, painful erosion. The constant tension with my mother was the water that wore down the stone of our marriage. Isabella and I grew distant, our home becoming a quiet, sad place. The final conversation was filled with tears and regret. I love you, Alex, she told me, her voice thick with sorrow, but I can't live in her shadow anymore. I can't keep fighting to be seen by my own husband because he's too busy looking at his mother. It was the bluntest, most painful truth I had ever heard. There was no affair, no single cataclysmic fight. We simply broke under the relentless, invisible pressure. We decided to separate amicably, or so I thought. We agreed to divide our assets fairly and to handle things with dignity and respect for the years we'd shared. It was a private, painful decision, and we agreed to tell the family together. That was our first mistake. We underestimated Beatrice. Before we could even arrange the meeting, my mother somehow found out. I still don't know how. Maybe she sensed the shift in my voice on the phone, or maybe she had an informant in our circle of friends. But she found out and she struck first. The narrative was no longer ours to control. I got the first inkling that something was wrong when I called Aunt Helen. Her tone was cold, clipped. "I'm just very disappointed in you, Alexander," she said, her voice laced with a judgment I'd never heard from her before. "After everything your mother has done for you, to throw it all away, and with that woman." "That woman?" I asked, confused. "What are you talking about, Aunt Helen? This was a mutual decision. It's sad, but Isabella and I just grew apart." There was a scoff on the other end of the line. "Oh, Alexander, you're either blind or a fool. Your mother told us everything. How Isabella was unhappy with the life you provided. How she was always spending your money on frivolous things. How she was seeing someone else." I felt the blood drain from my face. It was a complete fabrication, a twisted version of reality so far from the truth it was dizzying. I tried to correct her, to explain, but it was like talking to a brick wall. The foundation had been laid. My mother's version of the story was now the gospel. The calls to other family members were all the same. A cold shoulder from my cousin Mark, a lecture on family values from my uncle Robert, and a symphony of disappointed sighs. My mother had conducted a masterful smear campaign, painting me as a victim and Isabella as a villain. The irony was that in doing so, she made me the pariah. I was the fool who couldn't control his wife, the man who had failed to uphold the family honor by letting his marriage collapse. The divorce, which was meant to be a quiet, sad conclusion, was reframed as a dramatic betrayal, with Isabella as the lead antagonist and me as the weak-willed supporting actor. The family, which should have been my support system, became a jury, and my mother was the star prosecutor who had already delivered her closing arguments. I confronted her, of course. I drove to her house, my heart pounding with a mixture of anger and disbelief. She met me at the door with a look of feigned sympathy. "Oh, darling, I'm so sorry you're going through this," she said, reaching out to touch my arm. I pulled away. "Mom, what did you tell them? What have you been saying about Isabella?" Her face hardened instantly. The soft maternal mask dropped, revealing the cold, hard curator beneath. "I told them the truth," she said, her voice dropping to a steely whisper. "I told them what they needed to hear to understand why my son's life is falling apart. She was never right for you, Alexander. She was a flighty, selfish girl who didn't appreciate what she had. I saw it from the very beginning." "You saw nothing," I shot back, my voice shaking. "You saw a woman you couldn't control, so you decided to destroy her. You've twisted everything. You've turned our family against me." She raised an eyebrow, unmoved. "I haven't turned anyone against you, dear. I've simply protected you, there on your side." It was in that moment I understood the terrifying depth of her manipulation. In her mind, she was the hero of this story. She had saved me from the wrong woman and was now protecting me by controlling the narrative. The price of her protection was my relationship with everyone else I loved. I left her house that day feeling more alone than I ever had in my life. The collapse was complete. The cracks had shattered everything, and I was left standing in the ruins, isolated by the very woman who claimed to be my greatest protector. The months following the divorce were a slow, grinding isolation. Invitations to family get-togethers dried up. Phone calls became frequent and awkward. My attempts to explain the truth were met with polite skepticism or outright dismissal. "Well, your mother has a different perspective," was the common refrain. It was maddening. Beatrice had cemented her story so thoroughly that my reality sounded like a bitter, desperate lie. Thanksgiving was a quiet affair with a couple of friends. I saw the photos online afterward. The whole family gathered at Aunt Helen's, smiling for the camera with a conspicuous absence where I should have been. My mother was in the center of the photo, beaming, looking every bit the proud matriarch holding her family together. The caption, posted by my cousin, read, "So grateful for family in tough times." It felt like a punch to the gut. As Christmas approached, the loneliness intensified. Christmas had always been my mother's magnum opus, the culmination of her year-long curation of family perfection. The thought of it was unbearable. I received a single, sterile invitation from her which read more like a royal summons than a warm welcome. "We expect you for Christmas Eve dinner at 7 p.m. It's important we maintain appearances." There was no mention of the pain, the lies, or the chasm between us. It was a command to fall in line and play my part in her perfect holiday tableau. I couldn't do it. I sent a polite text declining, citing a need for a quiet holiday. Her response was immediate and cold. "Your absence will be noted. I hope you reconsider this selfish decision." I didn't. For the first time in my life, I was going to spend Christmas Eve completely alone. The day was as bleak as I had imagined. The city was alive with festive lights and the sounds of families celebrating while I sat in my silent apartment, the architect of a life now reduced to a blueprint for one. I ordered takeout, put on a random movie I had no interest in watching, and tried to ignore the crushing weight of my solitude. Around 9 p.m., overcome with a wave of nostalgia and a desperate need to feel some connection to a happier time, I went to the spare room closet. I was looking for an old photo album, but instead my hand brushed against a leather case I hadn't seen in years. It was my mother's old tablet. She had upgraded a couple of years ago and given me her old one, telling me to wipe it and sell it. I had meant to, but in the chaos of life, I'd simply forgotten about it. It had been sitting in the closet, a forgotten relic of a bygone era. I took it back to the living room and plugged it in. I didn't know why, maybe just to have something to do, a distraction from the deafening silence. To my surprise, it powered on, the battery still holding a residual charge. The screen lit up with her old background, a picture of me and my dad. A pang of grief hit me. I swiped it open. She hadn't even bothered to log out of anything. Her email, her social media, her notes, it was all there, a digital snapshot of her life from 2 years ago. I knew it was an invasion of privacy, but at that moment I felt I had nothing left to lose. My curiosity got the better of me. I opened her email app, not looking for anything specific, just scrolling through old messages. And then I saw the drafts folder. It had a number next to it, 14. That was odd. Why would she leave so many unsent emails on an old device? I tapped on the folder. The list of drafts appeared and my blood ran cold. The subject lines were all variations of the same theme: concerns about Alexander, an update on Isabella, some difficult family news. The recipients were my aunts, my uncles, my cousins. They were dated over a period of about a year, starting just a few months before my divorce was finalized. My hands started to shake as I clicked on the first one, addressed to Aunt Helen and Aunt Margaret. It was a long, carefully worded email, crafted with the precision of a surgeon. In it, my mother detailed a supposed conversation she'd had with me where I allegedly broke down and confessed my deep unhappiness. She wrote about Isabella's spending habits, her lack of respect for our family traditions, and her volatile moods. It was a masterpiece of fiction, filled with half-truths and outright fabrications, all presented as the tearful concerns of a worried mother. I clicked on another and then another. Each draft was a different version, tailored to its specific recipient. To my more traditional Uncle Robert, she emphasized Isabella's modern and disrespectful attitude. To my cousin Sarah, who had her own financial struggles, she painted Isabella as a greedy gold digger. For Aunt Margaret, the history teacher, she wove a narrative of a slow, tragic decline, peppering it with fake anecdotes and supposed quotes. These weren't just emails. They were calculated, strategic weapons. She would write them, refine them, perfect the wording for maximum emotional impact, and then presumably copy and paste them into her new device's email client to send. This old tablet W. As her workshop, it was where she had meticulously architected my downfall. She was building her case against Isabella and by extension me long before the marriage was even over. The whispers hadn't started after the divorce. My mother had been poisoning the well for months, ensuring that when the collapse finally came, everyone would rush to her side for water. Sitting there in the cold silence of my apartment on Christmas Eve, I wasn't just alone. I was the victim of a premeditated character assassination, and I was holding the unholy blueprint in my hands. The ghost in the machine wasn't just digital, it was the specter of my mother's true nature. The rest of Christmas Eve and all of Christmas Day were a blur. I didn't sleep. Fueled by a potent cocktail of shock, fury, and a strange, vindicating clarity, I sat with that tablet, meticulously piecing together the timeline of my mother's deception. It was like an archaeological dig into my own life, unearthing the foundations of a structure I never knew existed beneath me. The drafts folder was a treasure trove of malice. There were 14 distinct email chains she had been working on, but within those, there were multiple versions of each message, showing her process of refining the lies. She would change a word here, add a more emotive phrase there. It was chilling to see the evolution of a lie from a rough idea to a polished, convincing narrative. For example, an early draft might say, Isabella bought a new purse. A later version would become, Isabella made another extravagant purchase without consulting Alexander, who is working so hard to save for their future. It does worry me so. I began to cross-reference the dates of the drafts with my own calendar and memories from that time. One email, drafted in May, described a huge fight Isabella and I supposedly had over finances. I checked my calendar. That weekend we were on a happy romantic getaway for our anniversary. Another draft written in July claimed I had called my mother in tears, worried about Isabella's friendship with a male colleague. In reality, I had called my mother that week to wish her a happy birthday. Each lie she drafted was an insidious mirror image of a happy memory, twisting our reality into something ugly and unrecognizable. The puzzle pieces were falling into place, each one more painful than the last. I wasn't just reading lies. I was reliving my life through a distorted lens, seeing how my mother had been actively working against my happiness while smiling to my face. The Sunday dinners, the holiday gatherings, the cheerful phone calls, they were all a performance. Behind the curtain, she was sharpening her knives. The most damning discovery was a series of drafts under the subject line, "The Inevitable." These were written a full month before Isabella and I even decided to separate. In them, my mother was already laying the groundwork for the divorce, framing it as the tragic but necessary end to a toxic situation caused entirely by Isabella. She had written the script for my divorce before the final act of my marriage had even played out. She hadn't just reacted to the news. She had anticipated it, perhaps even encouraged it with her constant pressure, and was ready to seize control of the narrative the second it happened. She was positioning herself as the heartbroken but resilient matriarch who had to guide her family through the fallout of her son's disastrous choice in a wife. It was a preemptive strike of breathtaking cruelty. My investigation went beyond the drafts. I started looking through her old photo albums on the device, her notes, even her browser history. A picture began to form of a woman obsessed with control and image. Her browser history was full of searches for the social media profiles of my cousins, spouses, articles on dealing with difficult daughters-in-law, and forums for mothers who felt alienated by their sons' wives. It was a digital map of her insecurities and her need to be the sole female influence in my life. In her notes app, I found lists of Isabella's perceived slights, did not send a thank you note for the birthday check, wore white to the summer garden party, questioned my recipe for potato salad. It was a pathetic, petty chronicle of grievances that she had nurtured and magnified into justifications for her campaign. By the end of Christmas Day, my apartment was covered in sticky notes and printouts. I had created a visual timeline connecting each drafted email to a real-life event. I backed up everything from the tablet onto a secure hard drive, every email, every note, every damning search query. I had the complete puzzle. It was a horrifying, ugly picture of a mother so consumed by jealousy and a need for control that she was willing to systematically destroy her son's marriage and his relationship with his entire family to maintain her position at the center of it all. The grief I felt was immense, not just for my marriage, but for the mother I thought I had. That person never truly existed. She was a character curated and performed. The real Beatrice was the woman on that tablet, cold, calculating, and ruthless. The initial shock gave way to a cold, hard resolve. She had used lies as her weapon. I would use the truth as mine. She was an architect of deceit, but I was a real architect. I knew how to build a case, how to assemble evidence, and how to present a structure so sound it could not be broken. The puzzle was complete. Now it was time to build my response. With the evidence in hand, the fog of grief and confusion that had clouded my mind for months finally lifted, replaced by an ice-cold clarity. My mother had waged a quiet, insidious war on my life, using whispers and lies as her weapons. I would not stoop to her level. My response would be built on a foundation of irrefutable proof, presented with the calm, methodical precision of an architect unveiling a final blueprint. My retribution would not be loud or explosive. It would be a quiet, systematic demolition of her carefully constructed world of lies. My target was not the entire family, many of whom were just pawns in her game, but Beatrice herself. The goal was simple, to expose her not to a jury of our relatives, but to herself in a way she could not deny, dismiss, or twist. My first step was to organize the evidence. I created a master document which I privately titled the Beatrice Dossier. I sorted the drafted emails chronologically, placing each one alongside a corresponding entry from my own calendar, photos, or credit card statements that proved the reality of what was happening at the time. For the draft about our supposed financial fight in May, I included a photo of Isabella and me smiling on our anniversary trip, dated that exact weekend. For the email fabricating my tearful phone call, I included my phone records showing a single brief call to her number that day. I created side-by-side comparisons, the lie on one side, the truth on the other, complete with timestamps and digital evidence. It was a clinical, undeniable presentation of her deceit. I also included screenshots of her petty list of grievances from the Notes app and her revealing search history. The dossier grew into a 50-page document of pure, unadulterated fact. It was my weapon, and it was flawless. Next, I needed an ally. While my first instinct was to release the information widely, I knew that would be chaotic and could backfire, making me look vengeful and unstable, exactly the picture Beatrice had painted of me. I needed a strategic partner within the family, someone who valued truth and reason over drama. My thoughts immediately went to Aunt Margaret. As a history teacher, she was trained to look at evidence, to question sources, and to understand context. While she had been distant, her coldness had always felt more like confused disappointment than the blind judgment of Aunt Helen. I decided she would be my first point of contact. I called her and kept it simple. Aunt Margaret, I said, my voice steady, I know you've heard a lot of things about my divorce and about Isabella. I'm not asking you to believe me. I'm asking if you'd be willing to look at some information I've put together. That's all, just look. There was a long pause on the other end. I could hear her weighing the request. Alexander, she finally said, her voice cautious, I'll look, send it to me. I emailed her a password-protected PDF of the dossier. 2 hours later, she called me back. Her voice was trembling. Oh, Alex, she whispered. I had no idea. This is monstrous. The validation in her voice was the first real warmth I had felt from a family member in almost a year. We spoke for over an hour. She was horrified, guilty for believing the lies, and furious at her sister. She told me how Beatrice had presented everything with such conviction, crying as she spoke of her worries for me. Margaret, like everyone else, had fallen for the performance. What are you going to do? She asked, and that's when I laid out the rest of my plan. The annual New Year's Day family gathering was just a week away. It was a slightly more casual affair than Christmas, but the entire family would be there. It was the perfect stage. I wasn't going to cause a scene. I was going to set a trap. I need you to do something for me, I told her. I need you to talk to Mom before the party. Tell her I'm distraught, that I'm ready to apologize to the family for everything, and that I want to make a short speech at the party to clear the air. Aunt Margaret understood immediately. We were going to give Beatrice exactly what she wanted, a public spectacle with me as the penitent son, further cementing her narrative. We would inflate her ego, make her feel completely secure in her victory, and ensure she would be utterly blindsided when the tables turned. Margaret agreed, her voice now firm with resolve. She was no longer just an observer, she was my co-conspirator. The final piece of my plan involved technology. I bought a new, larger tablet and a small, discrete projector. I loaded the dossier not as a document but as a clean, simple slideshow presentation, each slide a single, devastating comparison of lie versus truth. The architecture of my retribution was complete. It was elegant, structurally sound, and designed for maximum impact. I felt no joy in it, only a grim sense of necessity. My mother had torn down my life. Now I was going to hold up a mirror so she could see the wrecker she had become. New Year's Day arrived with a cold, gray sky that perfectly matched my mood. I felt a knot of dread in my stomach, but also a sliver of steely determination. I drove to my mother's house, the tablet and projector in a briefcase on the passenger seat. When I walked in, the scene was exactly as I'd pictured. The house was filled with the sounds of chatter and laughter, the air thick with the smell of roasted meat and my mother's expensive perfume. About 20 family members were there, aunts, uncles, cousins. Beatrice greeted me at the door, her face a perfect mask of concerned affection. Alexander, darling, I'm so glad you came to your senses, she whispered, squeezing my arm. We've all been so worried. It was a masterful performance. To anyone watching, she was the loving mother welcoming her prodigal son back into the fold. Aunt Margaret caught my eye from across the room and gave me a subtle, almost imperceptible nod. The trap was set. My mother had taken the bait completely. Margaret had told me that Beatrice was thrilled with the idea of my public apology, even helping to suggest some of the things I should say to express my regret properly. For the next hour, I played my part. I was subdued, apologetic, and humble. I allowed Aunt Helen to lecture me on the sanctity of marriage and nodded meekly as my uncle offered unsolicited advice. With every passing moment, I could feel my mother's smug satisfaction growing. She floated around the room, the gracious host whose family was whole once more, her problem son finally brought to heel. She thought she was the director of this play, but she had no idea I had rewritten the final act. After the main course, as everyone was settling with coffee and dessert, Beatrice cleared her throat and tapped a glass with a spoon. A hush fell over the room. As we begin this new year, she began, her voice resonating with false emotion, it's a time for healing and new beginnings. Alexander has something he'd like to share with all of you. A few words to help us move forward as a family. She smiled benevolently at me, gesturing for me to take the floor. This was it. I stood up, my heart hammering against my ribs. I walked to the front of the living room near the large, blank wall beside the fireplace. I placed my briefcase on a small table. Thank you, Mom, I said, looking directly at her. You're right, it is a time for healing, and healing requires truth. I took the tablet and the small projector from my case. A few people looked confused, including my mother. Her smile faltered for a fraction of a second. I connected the tablet to the projector, and the screen of her old device, the login screen with the picture of me and my dad, was suddenly displayed on the wall for everyone to see. A collective gasp went through the room. Beatrice's face went white. Alexander, what is this? She demanded, her voice sharp. It's your old tablet, Mom, I said calmly. You told me to wipe it, but I never got around to it. It turns out to be a very illuminating device. I swiped it open and navigated to the prepared slideshow. The first slide appeared on the wall. On the left, under the heading The Lie, was a direct quote from one of her drafted emails to Aunt Helen. Isabella is spending his money frivolously. He confessed to me he's worried they won't be able to afford a house. On the right, under the truth, was a screenshot of my and Isabella's joint savings account from that same month, showing a substantial and growing balance earmarked future house. I clicked to the next slide. Another lie, another piece of irrefutable proof. I went through 10 slides in total, each one a dagger. The fabricated fight during our anniversary trip juxtaposed with a smiling photo of us on that same trip. Her claims of my tearful confessions paired with phone records showing short, mundane calls. The room was utterly silent, save for my calm, even voice narrating each slide. No one was looking at the wall anymore. Every eye in the room was fixed on my mother. Her mask of composure was shattering. Her face, which had been pale, was now flushed with a deep, mottled red. Her hands were clenched into tight fists at her sides. The final slide was the most damning. It was a screenshot of her notes app showing the petty list of Isabella's transgressions. Question my recipe for potato salad, I read aloud, wore white to the garden party. I turned off the projector. The image vanished, but the truth remained, hanging heavy and ugly in the air. This was never about my happiness or my marriage, I said, my voice quiet but carrying in the stillness. This was about control. This was a calculated, premeditated campaign to isolate me and destroy a woman whose only crime was that you couldn't curate her. I looked around at my family, at their stunned, horrified faces. You were all fed a story, a fiction crafted by a master storyteller. I'm sorry you were used as pawns, but the lies stopped today. I then turned my gaze fully on my mother. She was trembling, her eyes wide with a mixture of fury and panic. She opened her mouth to speak, but for the first time in her life, no words came out. The curator had lost control of her exhibition. The matriarch was alone on her throne. The New Year's revelation was complete. I had not shouted, I had not accused. I had simply presented the truth, and the truth had demolished her. The immediate aftermath was chaos contained in a vacuum of silence. For a long moment after I finished speaking, nobody moved. The only sound was the faint hum of the projector cooling down. Then Aunt Margaret stood up, walked over to my mother, and said in a low, shaking voice, "Beatrice, how could you?" My mother just stared back, her expression a ruin of her former composure. That single question broke the spell. Aunt Helen started crying softly. My uncle was just shaking his head, looking from me to my mother and back again, his face a mask of disbelief. One by one, people started to leave. There were no grand pronouncements, no dramatic exits. They just quietly gathered their coats and their purses, offering me brief, shell-shocked glances as they slipped out the door. It was like the slow, silent evacuation of a disaster zone. Within 15 minutes, the house, once so full of life and laughter, was nearly empty. Only I, my mother, and Aunt Margaret remained. My mother finally found her voice, and it was laced with venom. "You have ruined this family," she hissed, her eyes blazing with hatred. "I did this for you, to protect you from that awful woman." "No," I said, my voice devoid of the anger I had held for so long. All I felt was a profound, hollow sadness. "You did this for you. You couldn't stand to not be the center of my universe. The family isn't ruined because of the truth, Mom. It was already broken because of your lies." I packed my briefcase, turned, and walked out of that house, leaving her there with the wreckage of her own making. Aunt Margaret followed me out, placing a hand on my arm before I got into my car. "I am so sorry, Alexander," she said, her eyes filled with tears, "for not seeing it, for not listening." I just nodded. There was nothing more to say. In the weeks that followed, my life began to recalibrate. The family dynamics shifted seismically. Aunt Margaret became my staunchest advocate, speaking with every family member individually to make sure they understood the full scope of Beatrice's deception. Aunt Helen and a few others sent me long, rambling apology letters, filled with shame and regret for their gullibility. I accepted their apologies but kept a polite distance. The trust that had been shattered couldn't be glued back together overnight. Some bridges could be rebuilt over time, but they would need new, stronger foundations. Other relationships, I realized, were not worth salvaging. My relationship with my mother was one of them. She tried to reach out twice. The first was a phone call where she alternated between rage and tearful pleading, never once admitting fault. The second was a long, self-pitying letter that painted her as the true victim. I didn't respond to either. I was clearing the debris from my life, and the most toxic element was her. Cutting her out was not an act of revenge, it was an act of survival. The most unexpected consequence of the revelation was a call from Isabella. Aunt Margaret had reached out to her, sending her the dossier and explaining everything. She called me, her voice soft. "I just finished reading it," she said. "Alex, I'm so sorry. I knew she was manipulating things, but I never imagined it was like this. I'm sorry I blamed you for not seeing it. I was inside the house she was building, and you were still admiring the architecture from the outside." It was a conversation of immense relief and sadness for what we had lost. We met for coffee a week later. There was no talk of reconciliation, too much damage had been done, but there was understanding and forgiveness. We acknowledged that our marriage hadn't failed because we stopped loving each other, but because it had been subjected to a poison we couldn't identify in time. We wished each other well, and for the first time since the separation, it felt genuine. We were closing a chapter not as bitter exes, but as two people who had survived the same demolition. Today my life is quieter, but it is honest. It's built on a foundation of my own making. I have a smaller circle, but it's a circle of people I can trust. I have dinner with Aunt Margaret once a week. My relationship with some of my cousins is slowly mending. As for Beatrice, I hear she is a much lonelier woman now. Her curated world collapsed, leaving her with only the stark reality of what she had done. I don't feel triumph, only a quiet resolve. As an architect, I know that sometimes a structure is too compromised to be saved. Sometimes you have to tear it down to the studs, clear the debris, and start again. And that's what I'm doing. I am building a new life, one with integrity, transparency, and a foundation of truth that no one can ever poison again.